town of Southeast is located approximately 50 miles north of New York City in Putnam County. It is bordered by the towns of Paterson to the north and Carmel to the west, Westchester County to the south, and Connecticut to the east. Within the town's borders lies the village of Brewster, whose history is interwoven with that of Southeast. At the present time, there are few signs of the bustling economic activity once centered in Southeast: farming and mill businesses, the early American circus, the hub of two major rail lines, the Tilly Foster iron mine, and the Borden milk factory. By the late 19th century, Southeast had grown from an early farm-based community to an important commercial center. However, by the 1920s, this had rapidly changed due to the construction of the Croton Reservoir System, which contributed to the demise of many local industries. The Southeast Museum, located on Main Street in the village of Brewster, is dedicated to collecting, preserving, and presenting the history of the town of Southeast, an area referred to as the hub of the Harlem Valley. The museum is housed in the 1896 Old Town Hall building, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This video presents an overview of the town's history, highlighting the museum's collection and its permanent exhibits. Southeast began as a small community in an area that was once part of Dutchess County. The land was sparsely populated as boundary disputes between New York and Connecticut prohibited settlers from receiving clear title to the land. By the early 1730s, however, families from Long Island and Cape Cod began to move to the area. They built houses and cleared the forests for farmland. Much of the cleared wood was burned and the potash sold to New York City for use in the manufacture of soap and glass. This cash crop funded the purchase of oxen and the few essential tools necessary for starting a farm. Southeast farmers had to be enterprising in order to prosper. During the winter months, farm families made shoes from the hides of cattle that had been slaughtered to provide meat throughout the cold months. Some also made felt hats from the fur of muskrat and beaver trapped in the marshes. In fact, so important was this cottage industry that Southeast was once known as Hatsville. Most of the farm products had to be shipped by wagon to the western side of the county. From there, they traveled by sloop down the Hudson River to New York City. These early enterprises laid the foundation for future economic prosperity in the area. By the early 1800s, Southeast possessed a vibrant pre-industrial economy. Most of the available farmland had been cleared and planted. Many mills had been built for grinding grain and sawing lumber. Wealthier farmers accumulated cash for business investments. The circus arrives. Equestrian feats, menageries, and acrobats. During the early 19th century, farmers in and around Southeast began to invest in a new and unique business venture. This area would later become known as the cradle of the American circus. In 1793, Englishman John Bill Ricketts introduced Americans to the circus at his arena in Philadelphia, where trick riding was featured along with clown acts in the same show. In the 1830s, farmers in Southeast and neighboring towns began showing menageries, collections of exotic beasts from faraway lands. They soon combined the menagerie show with the acrobatic entertainment of trick riding, and these early circus entrepreneurs began taking their shows on the road, constantly adding spectacles and traveling to further places. Foremost among the circus families of Southeast were the Howes. In the summer of 1826, brothers Nathan and Seth B. Howes took a small show on tour up to Maine. So successful was this venture that they continued to develop their shows and by the late 1850s, Seth B. Howes was touring Europe and performing before heads of state. With his wealth, he remodeled the 18th century family home, Stonehenge, on Brewster Hill Road. Afterwards, he built a castle-like home, Morningthorpe, that is based on the Howes' ancestral home in England. Generally known as the Castle, the house sits prominently at the top of Turk Hill Road. Large replicas of circus lanterns grace the perimeter of the lawn where once animals paraded about. In its heyday, the circus involved almost every resident in some way: wagon builders, painters, blacksmiths, performers, and animal caretakers. Animals were kept in local barns with winter quarters at one time on Star Ridge Road. Imagine the spectacle of seeing elephants bathe in Peach Lake. One part of Southeast even earned the name Monkey Town, as this is where monkeys were often housed. Another famous circus personality who lived in Southeast was the English equestrienne Lily Deacon Forepaugh. Born in London, Lily came to the United States in 1882. She performed before royalty in many countries before she retired to Southeast. Always interested in the welfare of animals, Lily donated a fountain for animals that was erected in the center of Main Street. Today, there is little evidence in Southeast to remind us that it was once the center of circus activity. However, the majestic homes of the Howes family in Brewster, Seth B. Howes' mausoleum in Milltown Cemetery, and the Elephant Hotel in Somers still stand as testament to the area's greatest circus promoters. Even as elaborately decorated circus wagons were left to rot in its fields, a new development would come to Southeast, tying it to the major cities in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. The roar of the Iron Horse, the arrival of the railroad. Walter Brewster, architect and builder, foresaw the economic opportunities that the railroad could bring to Southeast. In 1848, knowing that the railroad would pass through the town, he purchased 134 acres of farmland from Gilbert Bailey. Walter Brewster then constructed passenger and freight depots for the railroad company, thus ensuring that trains would stop on his property. In 1849, the Harlem Line Railroad finally reached Southeast, connecting it to New York City and bringing everlasting change. Property prices soon rose, and Walter Brewster built many of the homes and businesses in the new community, which was soon referred to as Brewster's Station. When a second railroad, the Putnam Line, reached the town in 1881, the town of Southeast became known as the hub of the Harlem Valley. The new Putnam Line was the fastest route between New York and Boston. Local hotels such as the Brewster House, saloons, and barber shops served the travelers, while carriages provided transportation to surrounding towns. Brewster's Station became an important service point for the railroad company, and a round table and 14 service stalls were built for the steam locomotives. About 300 men worked for the railroad, and before each shift, the men could be seen walking to work, lunch pail in hand, from their homes on North Main Street. The railroads fostered the expansion of some local industries by providing quick and cheap transportation. One of these industries, mining, had previously been hindered by the expense of transporting iron ore to the blast furnaces where steel was produced.
They were friends, they were neighbors, or they became friends. The train became the meeting point. Like today, say a club or a tavern may be a meeting point for folks. Both young and old came and went on the train. And the train stations in Brewster were if you wanted to meet somebody in town, say, well, meet me at the train station. That was the center of activity. Well, the trains were dusty and dirty. The engines, the old steam engines, obviously burned coal, and there was no air conditioning then. And in a hot summer day, if you wanted some air, you had to open up that window, but you had to be prepared for some cinders to come in. So there were actually folks that had a full-time job just cleaning those trains between runs, sweeping the cinders away. One of the great things about the what I became fascinated with the old Putnam Division is the family atmosphere on the railroad, where there were people that wrote poems, and it was like going to a funeral, and it was a funeral train, that last train. And because the Putnam Division was known to pick you up in between stations if you lived between stations. They had birthday parties for you on the train. Commuting was not like today, where you have sullen-faced people reading the Wall Street Journal with a cup of coffee in their hand and no one talks. The train was a party, both coming and going into the city in those days, up until the late 50s.
While the Putnam Line is no longer in use, Metro North Railroad operates on the old Harlem tracks, providing essential transportation for the many Brewster residents who commute to New York City. Digging in the earth, iron mining in Southeast. Iron mining has been going on in Southeast since the late 18th century. These efforts were rather small scale, as the high cost of shipping the iron ore to local blast furnaces made it economically prohibitive. From 1806 until 1837, iron was mined on Brewster Hill, slightly north of present-day Main Street. The largest and most prosperous mine in the area was the Tilly Foster mine. During the 1870s, the owners of this mine built a narrow-gauge railroad from the mine to the Harlem Line Railroad. Soon they were shipping hundreds of tons of ore to the company blast furnaces in Lackawanna, Pennsylvania. The Tilly Foster mine produced magnetite, a valuable high-grade, self-fluxing ore ideal for the production of steel in the newly invented Bessemer process. In 1879, at the height of production, the Tilly Foster mine employed hundreds of workers, extracting 7,000 tons per month. Most of the miners who worked at the Tilly Foster mine lived in a nearby settlement. Fleeing from poverty in their native European countries, many immigrants came to the United States with the hope of making a better future for their families. During the 1870s, the Tilly Foster miners were primarily English and Irish, but in the 1880s, the majority were Italian immigrants. The owners of the Tilly Foster mine were eager to extract all the ore possible from their mine. By 1890, the method of removing ore from the mine shafts, some of which were 550 feet deep, was not producing enough ore. Therefore, they converted the mine to an open pit. At one time, the pit was the largest man-made hole in the world. Unfortunately, due to faults in the rock, the mine walls were extremely unstable, causing many rock slides and countless deaths. Finally, in 1895, there was a major collapse. The mine was declared unsafe, and the owners were forced to close the pit.
And they had been undercutting a great peninsula that stuck out from the side of the mine, on which a derrick-like structure would haul the ore and haul the men up and down with a rope arrangement, like an elevator. And they had been cutting further and further into that, and suddenly the whole thing just went. And it buried, some accounts said 14 men, others say 34, you can't really know. And one of the tragic things was that many of the miners, because they were from Italy, large numbers of them, and their names were so unpronounceable and strange to the Yankee mine owners here that they just gave them numbers, and they weren't even known by their names.
In 1935, John N. Traynor, who had a summer residence on Allview Avenue in Brewster, began collecting rocks and minerals that had been created in the cracks and fissures of the Tilly Foster mine. Part of his collection, on loan from the New York State Museum in Albany, can be viewed at the Southeast Museum. Condensed milk, new era in milk production. The railroads made possible the expansion of a second important industry in Southeast, the dairy industry. By 1855, Putnam County was supplying 10% of New York City's milk. At that time, dairy products were shipped in unsanitary oak barrels, often causing the milk to spoil. In 1856, inventor Gale Borden had finally received a patent for condensing milk, which was to make his fortune. In 1863, he built a modern and efficient condensery in Southeast that surpassed his other two plants. The factory was located on the east branch of the Croton River, near the present-day juncture of routes 6 and 22. Demand for condensed milk was high during this time due to the Civil War, and Borden began to see an immediate profit from his factory. At its height of operations, the Borden plant employed about 100 people and over 200 farms supplied the milk. Each morning, the farmers delivered their milk to the factory where it was carefully tested. After passing inspection, the milk was poured into huge vacuum pans where most of the water was boiled off at a low heat. The milk was then fed to a room where dozens of women filled the milk cans and sealed them with solder.
The good farmers arrived at the plant earliest. They had their milk cooled and ready for Borden's. Borden's was a 6-day operation. They did not operate on Sunday. So that on Saturday night, you brought in the production of a day and a half milk. And by the same token, on Monday morning, you brought in a day and a half accumulation for that extra day there was no delivery on Sunday. So you had to have ice to cool that milk and to keep it properly. There was inspection. The Borden's people inspected you twice yearly. The Department of Health came around yearly on top of that. So it kept the farmers pretty much in line.
The milk factory flourished for 2 generations. Gale Borden and his son John became benefactors of the town of Southeast. Unfortunately, by the turn of the century, much of the best dairy farmland was flooded by the reservoirs built for the Croton Reservoir system. The Borden Company had also built newer and more efficient factories in other cities. Milk production dropped in Southeast, and the condensery closed in the early 1920s. Most of it was later destroyed in a mysterious fire, although the remains of the dam, part of the building, and the turbine which powered the plant's machinery can still be seen today. Water, water everywhere, the Croton reservoirs. By the early 19th century, New York City was desperate for a source of fresh, clean water. Polluted water was causing many cholera outbreaks. In addition, the water supply was insufficient to help battle the many fires that ravaged New York City. In 1837, New York City began construction of a dam 6 miles upstream from where the Croton River enters into the Hudson River. The 400-acre reservoir created by this dam was supposed to meet New York City's need for centuries. However, it was soon found to be insufficient to satisfy the demands of the city's increasing population. Eventually, 11 dams and reservoirs were built on the Croton River, 4 of them in Southeast. These water systems would leave an indelible mark on the town economy and landscape. Much of the best farmland was flooded, and many properties were condemned in order to protect the purity of the watershed. Many homes, industries, and even whole communities were either moved or flooded. The work was carried out by thousands of immigrant Irish and Italian stonemasons. Their skill helped transform engineering structures into works of art. Today, the Croton Reservoir system supplies only 10% of New York City's water, And while the vistas created by the reservoirs have provided picturesque spots for leisure time activities throughout the years, much of the history of the area lies beneath their serene waters. The history of the town of Southeast is indeed rich and full. And while there may be few visible traces of the town's past, farm and dairy industries, the cradle of the American circus, iron mining, a transportation hub for 2 major railroads, and the extensive Croton Reservoir system, this history can still be explored at the Southeast Museum.